I think collecting is sometimes it is a gift and a curse. And I started collecting very early on in my life. I was most probably 11 or 12, and I collected a Ming knife from 225 BC. Very beautiful, simple object, promulgated by the emperor who commissioned the terracotta armies in China. And of course it wasn't a very valuable piece, but it had this age and it was authentic, and it started a lifelong interest in currency, largely currency here in Africa. I've made a huge collection over many years, and it stretches here from southern Africa all the way up into West and Central Africa, and it is a bit like a language. You know, you see the syntax designs changing from very beautiful copper crosses through to fantastically forged iron pieces right through the Congo. And we take iron so for granted today, but it was very valuable at the time. And a particular blade could be 200 man-hours, so it was what I call stored labor. This eventually led to further collections on expeditions through Micronesia and Polynesia, looking at the currencies that evolved there out of some of the hardest materials, which were the Tridacna shells, and creating fiber, so creating these big balls of fiber currencies that were firstly tithed in longish lengths, and then made into these large balls which were hung in the canoe houses as stored wealth. And so that collecting axis was very strong in my life. As a schoolboy, I also sought out Egon Günther, who was one of the major art dealers in the 1960s. He was German and had fled from Germany after the Second World War, and had been instrumental in creating the young group of artists of the time called the Amadalozi Group, with Cecil Scottness, Khumalo, Lechai, and Eduardo Villa, Cecily Sash, and Catania. And he had the only major private collection of African art in the country. There was nothing to be seen in the museums. And so Egon really taught me from very early on about the great qualities of African sculpture throughout the continent. Later I did meet Vittorino Meneghelli, who traveled in Africa and collected more contemporary pieces, but was also absolutely fascinating. So I acquired pieces from both these dealers over time, but once I started to travel, I collected in London and Paris and New York and Chicago and Zurich, and so my collection grew over many years, focused largely on Southern African material. So the very, very beautiful household objects which had symbolic import, like the headrests or the meat platters. And then once I started on the expeditions in the Pacific, my interest moved in that direction, and of course my home is filled with many objects which have traveled with me by boat from Papua or from Tahiti or Easter Island. And so I've been very interested in difference. So Gandhi says civilization is the celebration of difference. And I think that is such a beautiful phrase, because it is this capacity that we have as humans to invent, to create new ways of thinking, of looking at the world, of ingenuity. And of course, there have been many ways of problem solving across the planet. And so this has also led to many of my journeys to look at the craftsmen and the great artists that have made pieces over many centuries, and that the pieces, if I look at the Buddha heads or the Shiva heads and pieces that I have on my sleeping platform, I look at those at night, and they were carved hundreds of years ago, and they still have this perfection and serenity and power. And I think of who those sculptors were, and I still greatly admire them. So there have been those dealers and dealer collectors that have been important, certainly in my early childhood and in my initial training here at Wits University in Johannesburg. But once I started to travel, I was fortunate enough to, over many years, visit some of the great private collections in Europe and in America, getting to know the collectors and seeing the range of the works that they put together. And some collections which were famous and others not so famous. But you started to get a sense of who the people were behind the collections and the quality of the eye and, in a sense, the curation that happened there. When one looks at Richard Serra's collection, his pieces from the photographs are really rugged, very much like his own work. Whereas Aman was always very refined, or Udo Horstmann and his wife Wally would collect just great iconic pieces, a small collection but a great collection. And so by visiting those, I trained my eye, and one learns through seeing, asking, and obviously there are academics that I have spent time with. But I've learned as much from them as I have from the dealers, because the dealers very often really know the difference between something real and a fake. So they have had that knowledge, and they've been invested in the objects. So it's been fascinating to learn from both these sides. And I always say, museum collections are only as strong as the connection between the artists, the curators, the museums, and the dealers. If that's a strong combination, you have great collections. And of course, the collections deal with curation. And I studied sculpture, and when I completed my master's degree at Wits, I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to become an artist or a curator. I was looking into curatorial studies in America, and I was eventually given a scholarship to go and study at St. Martin's School of Art under Anthony Caro and Philip King. So my life took that sort of branch. But with the collections in my own home built up over many years, I've never had huge amounts of money, so when I did buy something, I had to be very strategically bought. So I bought visual equations over many years, building the collection so they have a coherence. So it was a form of curation in its own way, and I started curating when I was a lecturer and then a professor at Wits University. Over many years, exhibitions installed Art and Ambiguity, the first major exhibition of early Zulu Tsonga Shangaan art in this country at Johannesburg Art Gallery with Christopher Till and a group of wonderful academics. And then Evocations of the Child with Nessa Liebhammer and Merilee Wood. And I worked a bit with the Smithsonian, with the Metropolitan Museum and in Chicago, and got to know some of the great African art curators at those institutions, Christine Mullen-Kramer and Alyssa Lagama and Costa Pietrides. And of course that shapes one's vision. And I taught for 37 years at Wits University, and I loved my years of teaching. They were really extraordinary to have this interface between myself and the students, and we both learned a lot from each other. But at the same time, I did develop the curatorial. So when I retired a few years early, I joined Louis Norval and Marilee Foster in developing a new private art foundation in Cape Town, a destination museum which focused on historic, modern and contemporary. So we looked at major private institutions around the world and destination foundations like Louisiana or the Beile in Basel, and those of course formed the thinking around space, around its relationship to gardens, to storage, to lighting, and it was a wonderful gift to be able to work with them and the architects in Cape Town, DHK, and to evolve a building. And I've been involved for the last 8 years in curating major exhibitions there of Khumalo and Lechai, the two black sculptures that emerged in the 1980s, and Eduardo Villa, the sentinel sculptor who dominated South African sculpture for almost 40 years. And then David Goldblatt's On the Mines, a wonderful exhibition of William Kentridge's sculptures, the great black sculptor Jackson Hlongwane, whose crucifixes you see behind me here, who carved these in the 1960s. A priest, prophet, shaman living in a remote area, not that well known, but a great, great sculptor. So a huge exhibition of his at Norval, and at present the Preller retrospective, which really focuses on the remarkable body of work of this kind of mythological lexicon which he evolved over a lifetime. Exquisite paintings that are deeply inspiring. So my journey has been between a collector, an artist, and a curator. And in terms of being an artist, I taught for many years at the university to be able to produce what I chose to produce, not what the market expected of me or what politics expected of me, which was not always easy in this country, where for many years my interest has been in consciousness, in human evolution, in the big issues around space, which didn't always fit into the confines of a political structure within the South African context. And I have had to quietly forge my own path because of these other expectations living in a country like our own. And I do believe that there's place for the political and for other ways of looking. I'm always very thankful that both Hogarth and Blake painted in Europe, and that they give us two very different views of human society and the psyche. So in that process of making art, I exhibited extensively here, but then I spent many years with a wonderful dealer, Claire Cooper, who had her gallery in Cork Street, initially in London. And she promoted my work. I showed every second year in London for many years and built a beautiful range of people around the work and collectors in Toronto and London and New York, and the Smithsonian acquired and the Metropolitan Museum acquired and the British Museum. And so my career happened largely in the second part of my life outside the country, and I traveled extensively between these very remote parts of the world, and then also the major capitals, where I spent time in the major museums and with artists and, as I mentioned, collectors. So it's been an extraordinary journey of crossing over disciplines and ways of working within the art world. I've also written extensively about early Southern African material, which has been a deep interest of mine, of the early Zulu, Tsonga, Shangaan pieces, and which is related to the collection. But then also in more recent years, writing about Lwani and obviously Kentridge and many of the artists who I exhibit, who I've curated, I should say, and then, you know, have worked on books on Alexis Preller with Esme Berman, the great art historian, who was also a formative figure in my boyhood and in my early university years as the great historian of early South African art. And so there have been these amazing figures in my life, and I think one of the great gifts in life, that the greatest gift we can all be given, is to have somebody who has confidence in you. And that really is such an empowering thing, and if I think of Esme Berman, if I think of Philip Tobias or Nadine Gordimer and many of the older friends in my life who I've learnt so much from. And through Philip Tobias, I met the paleoanthropologist Donald Johansen, who found Lucy. And I've always been deeply interested in where we come from and where we're going, what it is to be human, and have spent time with paleoanthropologists looking at these incremental shifts in human evolution, be it in the cranial structures or in the human anatomy itself. And while I was studying in Berkeley in the late 80s into the 90s, in the late 90s, I spent time with Donald Johansen at the Institute of Human Origins and with a number of physicists there, which really did change my thought process. But and that of course led to the links between art and science, and formed the latter part of my career and the explorations in my work. But this quest of wanting to understand what it is to be human really led me to the Institute of Human Origins in Berkeley with Johansen, and there I met Carol Beckworth and the photographer, and eventually Angela Fisher, who've spent their lives in Africa documenting the extraordinary creativity both in social dynamics, visual dynamics, right across the continent, of incredible wisdom and beauty that has been evident on this continent over so many centuries. And the West tends to, through the media, only see the negativity of the politics, of the wars, of the dictators. And for me it has been remarkable over the years to see the tenderness, the beauty, the interaction of these two women across this continent. And so it's been a real privilege to journey with many different people and many different disciplines, understanding one's own continent and the world beyond. Well, I have spoken about my family to some degree, growing up here in a rather turbulent Rivonia in Johannesburg in the early years. And I was badly dyslexic, and so I really did battle at school. But I have to say that my dear sister Elizabeth edited me from most probably standard 1 to today. I write in a flow of consciousness with too many commas and no full stops, and she has over the years really trained me in writing and in thinking. We've learned so much from each other over the years, her from literature and linguistics, and from my side art, and from her husband Arthur Morgan, music. And so it was a very beautiful learning experience, and one that continues to this day. But my life has been a solo journey. I do not have children, but my friends are my family, and they are scattered all over the world. And they have been very close friendships over many, many decades. Some I've mentioned, like Donald Johanson or Carol Beckwith and Angela Fisher, and so many here within my own environment. Digby and Penny Hoots, he's the great ceramicist, and Russell Friedman, involved with ecology and the great game lodges, and he and Wilderness Safaris acquired North Island, which was this uninhabited island which we would get dropped off by fast boat or helicopter, and we spent time there just exploring the geology and the plants and the fish, and he eventually created an ecological lodge there, which led to a whole series of drawings of mine called In the Presence of Leaves, of the Coco de Mer plants, and these huge leaves, the largest leaves in the world, which still stand here in the corner of my studio, and led to a series of drawings. And so these people are largely part of my family. If I think particularly of Claire Cooper, my gallerist, who would think about my work constantly, it was always a dialogue. I never had to produce work that she could absolutely sell, but she followed my trajectory, and it was one of the difficulties really of not being able to really have a dealer in South Africa without feeling owned, and I have really never wanted to be owned. So my practice has been a quiet one, and but it has brought all these people together in my life, and there were extraordinary experiences also in my years of study, particularly the great History of Art department at Wits, Rory DePel, Charlotte Baer, Elizabeth Rankin. These art historians who came from the Courtauld Institute had an amazing knowledge of both historic art and contemporary art, I suppose art really of the 20th century, which really informed a lot of my thinking, and led to other parts of my family. So if I think particularly of the artists who have shaped my thinking, Marcel Duchamp, who was lectured to me by Rory DePel, formed a very strong central point in my thinking about the contemporary world, about the ready-mades, about the conceptual world, which really did change art from the moment that he presented his sculpture of the urinal. And his amazing large glass, and he and Brancusi, the Romanian sculptor who worked in Paris, were really the first to start working on the notion of an installation. Duchamp's Étant Donné at the Philadelphia Museum is an example of this, and Brancusi's studio in Paris today, recreated outside the Pompidou Center, has this deep understanding of the spatial relationship of objects and ideas, and so that spatial relationship in both their works is something that sits clearly within my own head. And when one looks at my own drawings, they are very precise, and many of them, and they deal with spatial relationships, with complex relationships between ideas, time, space. And in my studio, there are many objects which are very Brancusian and Duchampian. And of course, what I've collected influences what I make, and what I make influences what I collect. So there's been a wonderful dialogue with these two members of my family for many, many years. Then, of course, with this interest in other cultures and in traveling, Paul Gauguin's work interested me enormously. I think there's a kind of twist that's been placed on his work of being an exploiter, but I don't believe it. I think some of his paintings are some of the most respectful paintings of women that I do know. They are extremely beautiful. They challenged the Western world's aesthetic. He was deeply interested in Maori and the art from the Pacific. And that certainly is what led me also to have a look at the very early mares and the stone sculptures in the Marquesas Islands, and time on Easter Island, and in New Zealand with the Maori. And so that sense of openness to the artists of different cultures came to me largely through looking at his work and his challenge in many ways to colonialism. And so for me, my view of him is very different to the current view. And so these artists have been so important. Those, have been in the international world, but the carvers, the great carvers from South Africa, or the Zulu, Tsonga, Shangaan carvers, are the ones that, have always touched me deeply and that I have looked at carefully and written about. And in looking and trying to understand African art, it has been a way of understanding the language of the continent on which I was born and lived. I might be white, and of course there are such complex mechanisms that shape us, but I always feel so privileged to come back to this continent after traveling and to know that this is home, and that this is where I have assembled a series of objects which connect me to the rest of the world. And so my family isn't a genetic one. It is an artistic one which has been deeply inspiring and embracing in the life that I've lived. Interest in space has its origins most probably in looking at the work of Leonardo, and at the development, of course, of perspectival systems during the pre-Renaissance and Renaissance. And Leonardo's drawings sit very strongly within my head. He had this capacity to look with enormous clarity and dispassion. His drawings and his notebooks are deeply investigative, and I suppose that investigative nature of his work is something that has always moved me greatly. And that he is one of the earliest artists that understood this connection between art and science, and that one sees a clarity of thought around his exploration of the world, which is very unusual at a time when the world was asleep. That this man was able to engage in a complex way, both artistically and in a way that involved the military powers in Italy. And he was an inventor of weapons for Milan, for the Sforzos in Milan. And so this sense of objects that fly, objects that disappear to vanishing points, his interest in the celestial, have informed my own kind of thinking, where I spend these long periods with the astronomers, exploring space on a different level altogether, and that we have only been able to start measuring the huge distances in our galaxy and in our universe since the invention of the speed of light, our understanding of the speed of light. So before the speed of light, we were not able to calibrate distance, and of course light travels at such an unbelievable rate that if one thinks of a light year, I mean, it's almost inconceivable. I mean, I see the numbers and I can't quite grasp it, and then you start extrapolating that outwards. So there is this enormity which does interest me, of how the eye and the mind project deeply outwards into space, and how the lenses of our eyes and the cognition within our brain create these filters for us to be able to try to grasp and then transfer that insight into 2 dimensions. And so that's been one of the great projects with the astronomers, where they no longer are necessarily looking through a crystal or glass lens at light itself, but are looking at waves which are beyond the visible level, at X-ray, infrared and radio. These are our new telescopes which look at that invisible level which has to be translated. And so it is what I call a translucent world, a world where we can see to a large degree what is around us, but then there is other information which is very, very precise, which gets overlaid onto this. And so one's depth of understanding grows with that. And in my own work, on a modest level, the drawings look at that sense of layering, of insight, of what we see in the physical world, but what we see with the mental world, and how we also deal with mental abstraction. So my work ranges from drawings that were done purely with the mind's eye, to those looking very accurately at the world, then those which combine both of them, and then starting to work again with the astronomers on a very abstract level, or otherwise following my journeys into the Pacific or into the observatories around the world, be they in Hawaii or Finland or America. And so the context and the geography changes, and there are coordinates that as I've traveled, one starts to get a larger sense of the planet itself. In my travels, have visited many sacred places, and one of them was Delphi in ancient Greece. And this was the place where the oracle was to be connected to the gods and to humans. And in that visit, I came across the notion of the Phaedres, which are the mountains behind Delphi, which when they're wet, they gleam. So my early drawings are called the Phaedres, or the gleaming ones, which are seeing those ideas which are somehow larger than human and have a divine aspect to them. At Delphi there is the famous omphalos, which is a conic, well, it's almost like a conical shaped form. It's more like the tip of a rocket, actually. The omphalos is seen as the navel of the world, so it was seen as the center of the world, almost like the axis, the ancient axis of the world, which was this link between the terrestrial and the godlike. And of course, you know, today we have a very different axis through our planet, and the angle which talks to us both about the shift in light and the wonderful changes from spring to autumn. But these ideas around the axes between these big processes that we see around us and the divine, for me were so very much within that form. And in many of my early drawings you will see this conical-like form, or it sometimes is like a flaming field, which were related to the series of drawings which were made from the mind's eye, trying to map as accurately what I saw with my eyes closed in an internal world. So my whole career has really been a way of trying to map, be it the internal world, the external world, my perceptions of my travels, or insights around these extraordinarily abstract observations from the telescopes in deep space. And when we look at this great technology, it is the first time that our species is able to look into these enormous depths, and for us to start to understand where the universe came from. I mean, for me, what is so extraordinary is that for us to be at this point, to have these instruments which enable us to try to reconstruct how the universe was made, and to be sentient beings to the point where we are also able to look back to the evolution of our earliest ancestors, or our ancestors and our Earth itself is relatively recent. So this amazing ability of the human mind to try to understand the past, the present and the future, and how they at some point seem to collapse into each other as we understand this axis of insight.